I am Professor Asmita Basu. Today we are going to discuss about the risk and return. Now, the risk and return of a single asset or a single security means the return and the risk that is associated with a security or a share. Before we get into the detailed concept of this risk and return, let us first understand the definition of return. Now, the return in very simple terms means the return on the assets or specifically the investments that we have made for a given time period. Say, for example, the period is 1 year, and during this year, the income that we have made by investing is the return that we are receiving. Now, this particular return can be received in two ways. One is the return by capital gains, and the second is through the investments, dividends, and the interests received. Now, dividends and interests are received from the securities over a given period of time. For example, the dividends are given annually, the interests are given annually or semi-annually at times. That is one method or one way of receiving the investments. The second is the capital gain. Now, what is this capital gain? This particular investment that we had made, we suppose we had purchased a share. Now, this share we had purchased for rupees say 100. Now, after a period of time, when we are going back to the market to sell it, we see that the price of the share has increased to rupees 200. So, when we had purchased the share, the price we had paid was rupees 100. Now, at the end of the period, say the period is again 1 year, we are selling it and the market price now is how much? 200. So, this 200 minus 100, this 100 rupees is the capital gain from that particular security. So, for this period of time, we have received the capital gain 100, and suppose there was dividend which was given on this security. So, both the things together is the return that we are getting. Now, when we are talking about return, we have to keep in mind that there is risk associated with this investment and with the securities. We have always heard without high risk, there is no high return. So, high risk implies high return. Now, what is this risk? Now, risk is basically, if we try to identify its basic terminology or the definition, we will see it is the actual return that we are expecting, and the difference between this actual return and the expected return. So, actual return is something which we are getting in hand, whereas the expected return is the return that we are expecting from that investments to come. Now, many a times you will see, rather I should say that most of the times you will see that these actual returns and the expected returns do not tally with one another. That means there is a gap or a variance between these two. So, this gap or variance is identified as the risk of the security. So, this particular variability, as much as this variability is there, that is greater the variability, the riskier would be the security. A more certain return from an asset that we get implies that the amount of risk is less. Now, when we are talking about measurement of returns, as I have mentioned earlier, the total return on an investment for a given period is equal to the cash payments that are received during the period, that means your dividends or the interests, plus the price change over the period. That means what I have mentioned earlier is the capital gain. This entire numerator part divided by the price of the investment that we had considered at the beginning of the investment will give us the total return. To calculate the annual average returns, we can simply find out the arithmetic mean of all the realized returns for each year during that particular period. Now, when we have mentioned about the term that more certain is the return, less is the risk. That means those securities which gives us confirmed returns, assured returns, they are less riskier in nature. For example, the government bonds. Government bonds are regarded as the zero risk security. Why? Because the default risk associated with this type of security is zero. That's why the returns assured is the guaranteed and the risk associated is zero. Now, when we are talking about the expected return and risk of a single asset. Now, expected return of the investment is the weighted average of all the possible returns that are multiplied by the probabilities. Now, here comes the fact that when we are considering the expected returns, we have to consider simultaneously the probabilities. That means the chances of receiving such returns. So, actual return is the return that we receive in hand, and expected return is that return that we are anticipating and we are associating the probabilities or the chances of receiving such type of return. So, these probabilities of various outcomes, they are considered as the weights. Now, the expected returns are insufficient for decision making because this is just like one side of the coin. The other side of the coin that has to be considered is the risk that is associated. So, the most popular measure of risk is the variance or the standard deviation of the probability distribution of all the possible returns. Now, the measurement of risk. Now, we have seen that what is the basic idea of risk. Now, how to measure this risk? So, there are different ways we can measure the risk of an asset or a security. So, from the behavioral point of view, that is quantitative, as well as the statistical point of view. So, the behavioral point of view, we can measure risk by way of number 1, sensitivity analysis, and number 2, probability distribution. Now, the statistical measure of risk can be done through the very common methods, that is the standard deviation and the coefficient of variation. Now, what is this sensitivity analysis? This is a type of behavioral aspect of the returns that we are receiving. So, it is an analysis which identifies what if situation. That means it tries to predict the outcome for a particular decision if we have in hand certain variables. So, we have to consider a range of variables in order to calculate the sensitivity of each variable to the other. So, it takes into account a number of possible outcomes or returns while evaluating an asset or trying to assess its actual risk. So, by given set of variables, the analysts, they are trying to determine how the change in one set of variable or one particular variable can create a change or an impact on the outcome. So, if I change one variable, how it is going to create an impact on the outcome, how it is going to create an impact on the returns on the expected returns to be more specific, as well as the associated risks. So, this particular method estimates a possible approach to estimate the worst situation, that is through the pessimistic view, the expected situation, that is the most likely view, and the best situation, that is through the optimistic view. So, these are the three situations which are considered while doing the sensitivity analysis, and these three situations of the returns are associated with the assets. Now, coming to probability distribution, risk associated with an asset can be assessed more accurately by using the probability distribution. Okay? And this method of probability distribution is more effective than the sensitivity analysis. This is again, you can say, a part of the behavioral aspect. The probability of an event will represent the likelihood and the chances or the percentages of occurrence of such an event. Now, come to the statistical methods. The first is the standard deviation, which is the most commonly used method for assessing the risk. Now, this standard deviation. Now, what is the standard deviation? In statistics, we have learned to calculate the standard deviation, sigma. So, the same sigma is being used as the measure of risk. So, in case of statistics, you have seen that the standard deviation is actually taken as a deviation of the particular numbers from the mean of the numbers, right? So, it is deviation from the mean. Mean over here is now being replaced by the expected return. Okay. So, this particular standard deviation takes into account the dispersion around the expected value. Expected value over here is the expected return. So, basically the observations which are deviating from the expected mean of the returns will be considered as the deviations from the mean, and hence we get the idea about the standard deviation, which is nothing but the risk. Suppose the expected mean is of a particular security is 50. Okay. Now, if all the observations, that is the returns that you are calculating or observing, they are giving the same data of 50, is there any risk? No, because the mean is 50 and all returns are also 50. So, there is no deviation, there is no risk. So, all the returns are guaranteed at rupees 50. But in actual, does it happen like that? No. The observations of returns that we receive are deviating from the mean. So, we may get observations such as the return coming at 60, 70 or going down at 40, 30 or even below. So, these are the deviations from the expected mean of the return. So, this creates a risk. So, this is one of the most statistical measures, very accurately, which measures the risk of the security by understanding or calculating the deviation from the mean of the expected value of the return. Now, we come to the last part, that is coefficient of variation. Now, coefficient of variation is a measure of relative dispersion, that is risk, or a measure of risk per unit of the expected return. So, it is taken from where we have calculated standard deviation. So, one step ahead. It converts the standard deviation of the expected values into the relative values to enable the comparison of risks that are associated with the assets having different expected values. So, this is actually comparing the risk having different expected values. So, different sets of data will be taken, and you can say different sets of observations related to the returns, expected returns, and the other observations will be taken, and they will be compared in terms of risk. This coefficient of variation is computed by dividing the standard deviation, which we have calculated earlier, for an asset by its expected returns. So, first of all, we calculate the expected returns. Now, after calculating the expected returns, we calculate the expected risk by way of statistical measure standard deviation. Once we have calculated the standard deviation, that is the risk, we can also calculate the coefficient of variation, which is nothing but a measure of the standard deviation for the asset being divided by its expected returns. So, this actually gives us an idea about the basic concept which underlies the concept of return and risk of a single security. So, single security particularly we are considering in the beginning, because let us first understand how the risk and the return are calculated for one particular security, which will lead us to the next step where we have to identify the returns and the risk associated with the portfolio. Once we have identified the calculations, the methods of risk and return calculations for single security, then we move on to the diversification of risk, that is with the help of portfolio. So, we can create a portfolio that is having a number of securities. So, it is like a bunch of securities or a basket of securities, and this portfolio will take into the return of from all the securities and will try to diversify, that means minimize the risk that is arising from all these securities. So, when we are diversifying into a number of securities, the chances of offsetting the risk by the return are high. So, that is why instead of investing in a single security, it will be beneficial to invest in a portfolio of security. So, eventually we will try and understand the concept of portfolio risk and the portfolio return. So, that is all for now for the concept of risk and return of a single security. Later on we will discuss about the case study, with case studies, the numericals, how to exactly calculate risk, how to exactly calculate the returns. Thank you.